Hi, I'm Barbara.
Hi, I'm Melissa, and we're going to be presenting serotonin and dopamine. A neurotransmitter is a chemical signal that transmits action potential from one neuron to another when it is released from the presynaptic neuron into the synapse. When a neurotransmitter reaches the postsynaptic neuron, it binds to its receptor. The calcium ion channels located on the membrane of the presynaptic neuron are vital as they facilitate the release of neurotransmitters into the synaptic cleft, where electrical signals that traveled along the axon are converted into chemical signals. This causes the neuron receiving such signals to produce a specific response. There are three ways in which a neurotransmitter can influence a neuron: excitatory, inhibitory, or modulatory. Excitatory promotes action potential in the receiving neuron, while inhibitory prevents it. Whether it is excitatory or inhibitory depends on the receptor it binds to. Neuromodulators, however, operate at a slower rate and regulate populations of neurons. Now that we've discussed what neurotransmitters are, let's move on to hormones.
Have you ever wondered, what are hormones? Let me tell you. Hormones are a chemical messenger that are secreted into the blood by one cell that affect the functioning of several other cells. While some hormones can affect all cells in the blood system, the majority affect only a limited amount of cells, which are referred to as target cells. The target cells are able to respond to a specific hormone if they have the according receptor for said hormone. By acting on the receptor on target cells, hormones are able to regulate and coordinate physiological and metabolic functions in the body. There are different types of chemical messengers, all which depend on the type of hormone we're dealing with. Now that we know what hormones do, let's move on to what we'll be talking about today: serotonin and dopamine.
Now moving on to what dopamine is. Dopamine is an organic chemical of the catecholamine. I'm sorry, just no. I forgot it. Now moving on to what dopamine is. It is an organic chemical of the catecholamine family, functioning both as a hormone and neurotransmitter. It is produced in several areas of the brain, including the substantia nigra and the ventral tegmental area in response to an expected reward. It is a neurohormone produced from the amino acid tyrosine and released by the hypothalamus. Dopamine is an important chemical messenger involved in reward, motivation, memory, and even regulating body movements. It is known as a feel-good hormone as it contributes to pleasure and reward. When an organism associates a certain activity with pleasure, mere anticipation may be enough to raise dopamine levels, reinforcing a cycle of motivation. Now to the chemical structure. On the right, we can see that it is a benzene ring with two hydroxyl groups and one amine group attached via an ethyl chain. The amine group contains a basic nitrogen atom with a lone pair of electrons, which bonds to the two hydrogen atoms. The catecholamines play a key role in helping the body prepare for fight or flight reactions in response to stress. So now talking about the sending cell and receptor cell. Since it functions as a neurotransmitter, it is released by nerve cells in the substantia nigra and sends cells to other nerve cells. Dopamine receptors are a class of G protein coupled receptors that are most abundant in the pituitary and brain. In the image, we can see that this on the left, the neuron, this a signal to another neuron, which then goes into the synapse and then it releases the dopamine. On a microscopic response, it is associated with pleasurable sensation, satisfaction, and motivation. An initial response to a rewarding stimulus encodes information about the value and context of a reward. If one feels good about achieving something, it is due to the surge of dopamine in the brain. Healthy levels of dopamine drives organisms to seek and repeat pleasurable activities. In some cases, exposure to substances and activities that increase dopamine can become addictive to some people. Now, talking about the signaling pathway, the release of the neurotransmitter dopamine in the presynaptic neuron results in signaling in the postsynaptic neuron through D1 and D2 type dopamine receptors. D1 receptors signal through G proteins to activate adenylate cyclase, causing CAMP formation and activation of PKA. This can be seen in the first image to the left, where tyrosine activates the L-DOPA, which then activates the dopamine to be released in the synapse. This release causes ATP to be converted into CAMP, which then converts to PKA, which then starts the transcription process. This demonstrates a heteromer signaling pathway in the brain. On a molecular level, dopamine binds to alpha-1 and beta-1 adrenergic receptors, mediated through myocardial beta-1 adrenergic receptors. Dopamine increases heart rate, increasing cardiac output. Now for the regulation, dopamine is associated with seeking behavior. It works to motivate people to seek out information and entertainment. Once a target is achieved, the hypothalamus releases dopamine to deliver chemical reward that organisms pleasure. Through experiencing the cycle repeatedly, organisms anticipate pleas from seeking, which perpetuates the dopamine-driven feedback loop. When the neuron releases dopamine, it will bind to the postsynaptic dopamine receptor and the presynaptic autoreceptor. The binding of dopamine to an autoreceptor inhibits the neuron from releasing more dopamine, demonstrating a negative feedback loop. Unexpected rewards increase the activity of dopamine neurons, acting as a positive feedback loop, signaling for brain regions associated with the preceding behavior. In these diagrams, we can kind of see what the positive feedback loop is. So from social media, if you gain like a lot of comments and likes, you are waiting for more rewards. And then for the image to the far right, we can see a negative feedback loop with the dopamine and the protactin. So a common disorder with dopamine is Parkinson's disease. The cause of this is the loss of nerve cells, which causes the dopamine to no longer be produced. And then symptoms of this are trembling in the hands, arms, legs, and jaw, stiffness of the limbs, mostly in the arms, shoulders, or neck, and then slowness of movement, which then decreases reaction time and facial expressions, and overall the gradual loss of automatic movement. For treatment, the gold standard of Parkinson's therapy is levodopa. This medical treatment works to elaborate the network of fine blood cells and that filter blood reaching the brain, where it is then converted into dopamine. Parkinson's patients are treated with medications just to relieve the symptoms of the disease.
Okay, now moving on to serotonin. Serotonin actually acts as both a neurotransmitter and a hormone, and it's known as the chemical messenger for all living cells. It's mainly found in the brain, bowel movements, which is your stomach and intestines, and blood platelets. Serotonin is considered a hormone because when released into the bloodstream, it sends messages to parts of your body, which is why it's commonly found in your blood platelets. It is also considered a neurotransmitter because it serves as a messenger of information in your brain that travels from one neuron to another. Serotonin is the key hormone that stabilizes our mood, feelings, and happiness. It also allows brain cells and other cells in the nervous system to communicate with one another. It plays a major role. Okay, do you ever wonder what makes you happy? It's serotonin. Serotonin actually acts as both a neurotransmitter and a hormone. It is known as a chemical messenger for all living things. It is mainly found in the brain, bowel movements, which is your stomach and your intestine, and blood platelets. Serotonin is considered a hormone because when released into the bloodstream, it sends messages to parts of the body, which is why it's so good. Do you ever wonder what makes you happy? Serotonin. Serotonin actually acts as both a neurotransmitter and a hormone. It is known as the chemical messenger for all living things. It is mainly found in the brain. Stop looking. Do you ever wonder what makes you happy? It's serotonin. Serotonin actually. Do you ever wonder what makes you happy? Do you ever wonder what makes you happy? It's serotonin. Serotonin actually acts as both a transmitter and a hormone. It is known as a chemical messenger for all living things. It's mainly found in the brain, bowel movements, which is your stomach and intestine, and blood platelets. Serotonin is considered a hormone when released into the bloodstream. It sends messages to parts of the body, which is why it's so commonly found in your blood platelets. It is also considered a neurotransmitter because it serves as a messenger of information in your brain that travels from one neuron to another. Serotonin is the key hormone that stabilizes our mood, feelings, and happiness. It allows brain cells and other cells in the nervous system to communicate with one another. It plays a major role in sleeping, digestion, consciousness, cognition, vomiting, and sexuality. Serotonin is an inhibitory neurotransmitter, which means it does not stimulate the brain. Adequate amounts of serotonin are necessary in order to balance excitatory neurotransmitters firing in the brain. Serotonin is produced in the central nervous system in an area of the brainstem called the raphe nuclei. Although it acts as both a hormone and a neurotransmitter, we will be focusing more on its role as a neurotransmitter. Serotonin and its chemical structure. Okay, now moving on to the chemical structure. The chemical formula for serotonin is C10H12N2O. It is also known as 5-hydroxytryptamine, and it is derived from an amino acid called tryptophan. It is a polar molecule where the first part has a hydroxyl, which easily reacts with other compounds and is capable of forming hydrogen bonds. The other part of the molecule, known as the ring indole, also has a great electronegativity potential due to the presence of a pair of alone electrons on the nitrogen ring. Sending cell and receptor cells in serotonin. Serotonin is made by a unique biochemical conversion process. It begins with tryptophan, a building block to proteins. Cells that make serotonin use tryptophan hydroxylase and a chemical reactor which, when combined with tryptophan, forms serotonin. Most of the peripheral serotonin is synthesized by the enterochromaffin cell in the intestine, secreted into the bloodstream, and then taken up by circulating platelets. Serotonin receptors are a family of guanine nucleotides, triphosphate binding protein coupled receptors, and one ligand gated ion channel that transduce an extracellular signal by serotonin to an intercellular response. Serotonin has multiple actions by binding to distinct cell surface receptors, which have been classified in many groups. The serotonin 1A receptor is the most extensively studied of the serotonin receptors and belongs to a large family of 7 transmembrane domain G proteins coupled receptors, which is the one shown in the diagram right there. The macroscopic response of serotonin. The serotonin subtypes mediate a variety of psychological responses in the GI tract. Responses include activation of secretory cells, afferent and efferent neuron activation, and direct effects on gut smooth muscle, resulting in either smooth muscle contractions or smooth muscle relaxation. In both primary and human serotonin functions tend to covary positively with prosocial behaviors such as grooming, cooperation, and affiliation, and tends to covary negatively with antisocial behaviors such as aggression and social isolation. The serotonin signaling pathway. Researchers have identified 7 different families of serotonin receptors, which differ from one another in distribution. The substances that bind to them and the effects they mediate. All but one of those families of the receptors consist of G protein coupled receptors. The other receptors of families consist of ligand-gated ion channels. Serotonin is removed from the synaptic cleft by a transport protein called serotonin transporter. The most common receptor is the one shown in the diagram. It's called 5-HT1A. And there you see it binding to the end of the neuron, and then it'll travel. Yeah. Okay, the negative feedback loop of serotonin. Negative feedback of serotonin release in the brain is controlled in a part by multiple negative feedback loops. When a serotonin reuptake inhibitor is started and serotonin release increases, these negative feedback loops immediately come into play and reduce the serotonin release, at least initially. So it's basically a bunch of little negative feedback loops all inside one big negative feedback loop. Okay, now moving on to disorders caused by imbalances of serotonin. Low levels of serotonin are often associated with many behavioral and emotional disorders. Studies have shown that low levels of serotonin can lead to depression, anxiety, suicidal behavior, and obsessive compulsive disorders. Selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors are agonists of serotonin. SSRIs increase the amount of serotonin available in the brain and are commonly prescribed for depression. They allow for the brain to regain its balance and produce serotonin as needed. Too much serotonin causes symptoms that can range from mild shivering and diarrhea to severe muscle rigidity, fever, and seizures. Severe serotonin syndrome can cause death if not treated. Cyproheptadine is an antihistamine that is sometimes used to block serotonin production in the body. It has been shown to reduce the severity of symptoms associated with serotonin syndrome. OCD is also a known disorder that can be developed from low levels of serotonin. When low serotonin levels are experienced by someone with OCD, it can make them edgier and more hyper-aware of their environment than usual, resulting in an increased OCD-related behaviors such as obsessive hand-washing, counting, or organizing. However, long-term treatment with high doses of clomipramine, fluvoxamine, and fluoxetine, sorry if I said that wrong, tend to correct these neuropeptide abnormalities and raise serotonin levels. So those were our little neurotransmitters / hormones. Thanks.